about that in the next lecture when we talk about CSS. It's going to make more sense when we talk about that. So here I have an example of H1 text. You can see like the text phrase, this is an H1 text and it's wrapped in an H1 header, and it comes out looking like what's in the box without the lines, of course. That is an H4 text. You can see it differentiates in that it's smaller, and I guess sort of the boldness is different. Okay, the next element is break. You guys should be familiar with this if you guys have used MySpace. So break is just a HTML tag that specifies a new line. So if you want to make sure that things don't get wrapped together, you'll stick a break into it and it'll move that text to a new line. So example, if you do one break, put here's some text and make a break, you put here's more text, it'll put the second line of here's more text into a different line in the HTML document. Yep.
I heard from a friend that it's good practice to have the backslash, but do you really need it, or?
Break is actually like one of those elements that doesn't have, like, it doesn't need a closing tag to it, but
it's good practice. You don't need it, but it's good practice.
So where would you put the closing tag at the end of the second here's more text?
So when you use break, so there's certain elements, most HTML elements have an opening tag and a closing tag, and you encapsulate your content between the two tags. There are certain elements like break and image that we're going to go into that don't have a closing tag. And what you do in that case is you do a slash you do a slash in the opening tag or just the tag itself there, just like that. So you kind of combine them together, you squish them together.
Oh, when you said it's good practice, you weren't referring to?
No. So you could write break without the slash, but it's good practice to have a slash in the back also. Just to denote that it's a single element and that there's no more closing element.
Okay.
Then the second example, you put two breaks, it adds an extra line. So pretty simple. Brief overview on URLs again. I talked about this last time. So URLs consist of several different pieces. It's your protocol that you start with. It should be HTTP for most of the time. And then you have your prefix. In this case, it's www. I guess from your experience with their websites, we actually have a prefix DeCal, .awindustries.com, where DeCal is our prefix. So we can have different kinds of prefixes. And the domain here is berkeley.edu. In the case of our site, it would be aw-industries.com. And then we have a path here along with the file that is located inside of this path. Is everyone okay?
I had a question for the previous slide. The breaks. Is there a way to specify the size of the breaks, or do you have to keep doing break throughout?
Yeah, you keep doing it.
Really? Yeah. There's no shortcut?
I mean, you could. It's not really.
Isn't the bracket and the
P is a paragraph.
Actually, for breaks, you're not going to want to use breaks when we introduce CSS.
Yeah.
I think breaks is actually one of the things that are deprecated. But we chose to put them in the slide because it's something that you will see a lot if you do web work. But in the future, you're going to use stuff like margins and not use breaks.
Okay.
It'll be clear when we get into that.
All right. Okay. So absolute versus relative URLs. This is something new that I didn't cover last time. So as an example, we're going to use this site called http www.dog.com/tricks/jump.php. And on this page, there's an image, and the absolute URL of that image is www.dog.com/tricks/jumpingdog.jpg. So one of the things that you can do when you ever link an image is you can do something called a relative URL instead of using something that's absolute, which is the case right here. So a relative URL will look something like this, where you have where you start with basically disregarding the domain and starting at the root, and you start at /tricks/jumpingdog.jpg. and you'd be able to link that image by just inserting that URL as opposed to the absolute URL. Another type of relative URL is just called relative URL. The previous one I was talking about is something called root relative. The difference between these two is that the relative URL is relative to the current page that you're on. So in this case, we're in the page /tricks/. So the relative URL for the image jumpy dog is just jumpingdog.jpg. And the root relative refers to the relative URL relative to the root relative to disregarding the root. So does anyone have questions on that? Is it confusing? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, when do you use a relative URL?
So good question. The difference, the reasons why you might want to use a relative URL is sometimes when you're like making code changes and maybe you're moving to another site or something, or you're moving a document to a different folder, having a relative URL will become useful because you won't have to re-code these absolute URLs, right? Because they'll be relative to the folder that they're in, and if you just move that folder somewhere else, you're good. You don't have to go back into the HTML document and reset all these URLs if you have absolute URLs. Right? Okay, the next thing is anchors. These are typically used to render links, as you would see them from like a Google search. They're also sometimes used to render images. In that case, we're going to go specifically more on later in the course about how anchors are used with images. So in Anchor, there's different types of attributes. One of them is href, which specifies the URL which you're creating an anchor for. So that URL, if you put like google.com, it will have a link where it shows google.com. Which will link to google.com. It might not necessarily say google.com. And you have something called a title attribute, and it specifies a text that's to be inserted in the tooltip. And a tooltip is essentially a message that appears on the link when you hover your mouse over it. So it's going to have a little box that pops up that'll show you what the title is. And of course, within the anchor tags, we have the text. And that's what you basically name your link. So I have an example here where you have href. It's going to be pointing to google.com. And the title of the tooltip is called click to redirect to Google. And the name of the link is called a link to Google. So it's going to look like this. So here's your text here. It shows up here. And your tooltip. You can't see the cursor that I hovered over because the print screen doesn't work that great. So I had actually put my mouse somewhere around here, and when I did, it basically created this little text block here that said click to redirect to Google, and that text block came from the title I set.
Is the title optional?
The title is optional. So I think if you don't specify the title, it should be. I think the default should be the text. I'll get to that later. It's in another slide. Okay, so the other thing is an image tag. Image tags are used specifically for images. So we have a couple of attributes here. First is the source, which is the URL that you specify for that image. And then you have something called an alt, which is an alternative. In some cases, maybe the image that you're linking to gets broken. Maybe the server is on a different server and it crashes. So what alt does is it represents an alternative description for that image itself. All right. So as an example, if you have this image tag here that links to the Google image. It's going to appear as a Google image itself along with this URL. And the alternative, if the link was not working, would be Google logo. It would show a text that said Google logo. And I have an example of that here. So what happens is if you put inside the source some bad URL, it's going to appear as an X, which I'm pretty sure you've seen a lot when pages don't get rendered fully. So it's going to appear as an X, and if there's an alt attribute, which is not required, it will have Google logo as the text. Yeah.
Alright. So the description, is that also what's like if you have someone who's visually impaired and they're using software that like reads what's on the webpage to them? Is that what the software also reads? Like isn't that another important part of it?
I'm not sure about how accessibility works for people who can't visually see a website.
But I mean, like, isn't that a best practice whenever you're doing a website? Like, if you have an image,
well,
like,
it is a good practice, but it's it's not absolutely necessary. It depends on what you're doing, and rather like the importance of the image. Like if you go to Facebook.com, you notice that if some link or some image doesn't load up, that they're not going to have some alternative text. They're probably guessing that you try to reload the page and try to grab the image. So, I mean, it's not necessary. It depends on what you're doing, whether you want it or not.
Yeah, it's also nice to have alternative text because if you're viewing the webpage on some kind of browser where you have like images disabled, for example, if you're like going from like a mobile browser on like some really old phone, you want to disable images because they take too long to load, it might be nice to have some alternative text. So if that's something that you want your website to offer, you can have alternative text, but it's not like super necessary.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So now I'm going to talk about something called block versus inline elements. I know I haven't talked about key or span elements yet, but just hold on for a second. So certain types of elements in HTML are block elements and certain types are inline. And they differ in the way that they display each other. And in this case, what block elements do is they have a sort of implicit new line before and after itself. So if you were to put this paragraph here, it would create a new line here, and if there's something before it, it would have created a new line above it. And in this case, you have a paragraph, a span, and another span. So you can see that what the paragraph has done, because it's a block level element, is it's pushed these span elements, which are inline elements, over to the next line. So it's going to be kind of important to know this and understand this when you're doing a lot of the CSS stuff to style it. And you're going to have to troubleshoot. Sometimes you'll notice things don't appear right. They might appear on the next line. This might be the reason. All right, so about paragraphs. Okay. Ignore that first thing. So, like I said about paragraphs, they implicitly have a new line before and after the element itself, and they're block level typed elements. So here's an example. You have the span here, and the paragraph is before and after two spans. And what it does is instead of staying in line with the span itself, it creates a new line before and after. So this is a simple example of a span. This HTML element seems to do nothing, but it'll be kind of important later on when you start learning about the styling that you can apply to it. So if you were to just put I'm a span inside a span, it would just appear as a simple text. The next thing is something called a div, which sort of stands for division. And what a div is it's also another block level element similar to a paragraph, and it acts the same way in that it has a new line before and after. Yeah.
What is the paragraph also has a new line before and after?
Yes.
So what are the cases where you use paragraph versus a div?
We're going to get more into that when we talk about styling.
Well, the purpose of HTML is to kind of give a hint to things like search engines about what your content actually is. So when you use a div, even though it does essentially the same thing as a paragraph, you use div for other things than just like text. So when you use paragraph, you're actually saying that this text within me is a paragraph. It's some kind of paragraph with text. So it's even though visually it doesn't do too much more, good coding